Hello everyone, and welcome to my The Bold Fans channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Brooke Logan stood at one end of the table, shaking as she held the rim of a crystal wine glass. Her blonde hair, which was usually flawlessly styled, was slightly unkempt, as if she had rubbed her fingers through it in anguish. Her eyes, wide and shining with unshed tears, flew between her family's faces, looking for an ally, a savior, anyone who could relate. But the room was full of accusations and she was drowning. Across from her, Nick Marone stood obstinate, his jaw set and big shoulders braced, as if bracing for a physical assault. His black eyes flashed with a mix of guilt and resolution. A man caught in a tempest of his own creating who refused to give up. Their affair had been whispered about for weeks, with hushed talks in the halls of Forrester Creations and sidelong glances at board meetings. But it all came crashing down tonight. Ridge Forrester, the family patriarch and Brooke's on-again, off-again husband, stood at the head of the table. His dominating presence belied the wrath emanating from him. When he talked, his voice was low and deliberate, each syllable a dagger directed at the two individuals he had placed the most trust in. Did you think you could hide this? From me? From each of us? His palms curled into fists, the white knuckles against the dark wood table. You've betrayed everything we've built, everything I've fought for. The room fell silent as Ridge's words hung in the air like a guillotine. Brooke opened her mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. What might she say? The truth was evident, as evidenced by the photographs that had appeared earlier that evening. Grainy images of her and Nick, stolen moments in a dimly lit hotel room, their bodies too near and their intentions clear. The photos had been anonymously mailed to Ridge and slid under his office door in a plain manila package, but their impact was far from subtle. I didn't mean for this to happen, Brooke finally said quietly, her voice barely audible. Ridge, I swear it wasn't planned. Ridge raised his voice, loud and cutting. Do you expect me to believe that? After all the times you've promised me fidelity, and all the years we've spent trying to make this work? He turned to Nick, his gaze narrowed. And you? My brother. My pal. How could you? Nick's jaw twitched, but he did not look away. It wasn't to hurt you, Ridge. The other family members, Eric, Stephanie, Thorne, and Felicia, exchanged surprised looks as they said, "It just happened." Stephanie, ever the matriarch, sat rigidly in her chair, her lips drawn into a fine line. She had never been Brooke's biggest fan, but even she appeared taken aback by the extent of this treachery. Eric, the ever-present peacemaker, sought for his wife's hand, but he too was unable to find words to calm the situation. Brooke's daughter, Hope, sat motionless, her hands securely gripped in her lap. Her eyes, like her mother's, were filled with a combination of perplexity and pain. She had always admired Brooke, seeing her as a pillar of strength, a woman who fought for love despite the difficulties. But suddenly that image was deteriorating. "Mom," she asked gently, her voice quivering. "How could you do this to Dad?" Brooke's heart broke at the sound of her daughter's voice. Brooke made a step toward Hope, but the child flinched, forcing her to stop. "Hope, please," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I love you. I adore your father." "Then why?" "I never wanted to hurt anyone." Hope's voice swelled, her eyes filled with tears. "Why are you doing this?" Brooke had no response. The truth was a tangled web of emotions, loneliness and desire, moments of weakness that had spiraled out of control. She had always loved Ridge, but their marriage had been a roller coaster of passion and anguish, with breakups and reconciliations. And Nick had been there, sturdy and strong, a shoulder to depend on when Ridge was preoccupied with his work or his uncertainties. One moment of vulnerability led to another, and she found herself in over her head. Nick, sensing Brooke's distress, took a step forward. "This isn't just about her," he continued, his tone stern. "I am just as responsible. I sought her. I knew what I was doing," Ridge said, his eyes flashing. "Did you pursue her? Do you believe that makes things better? Do you believe that excuses you going behind my back and lying to my face?" He took a stride towards Nick, his hands clenched. "You were my brother, Nick. I trusted you." The word brother hung in the air, loaded with significance. Nick was not a Forrester by blood, but he was accepted into the family and treated as one of their own. He had worked alongside Ridge at Forrester Creations, sharing many late nights and hard-fought wins. And now that link has been severed, fractured by a treachery that goes deeper than any business competition or family quarrel. "I'm sorry," Nick muttered, and for the first time his voice faltered. "I never intended to hurt you. But I adore her, Ridge. I've loved her for a long time." The statement shattered the silence in the room. Brooke's breath caught in her throat, and she looked at Nick, her eyes wide with surprise. She knew he cared for her, and she could feel it in the fleeting moments they'd spent. But love? That was something neither of them had dared to say. Ridge's face distorted in anger and sorrow. "Do you love her?" He spat. "You think you deserve to stand there and confess your love after everything you've done? You cannot claim that. You don't get to rip my family apart and call it love." The room was whirling now, emotions crashing like a hurricane. Stephanie stood with her chair scratching across the floor. "Enough," she exclaimed, her voice cutting through the commotion. "This has progressed far enough. Brooke, Nick, you've both made your decisions, and now you'll have to live with the consequences." Brooke's knees trembled and she sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, judging and condemning. She had always been the outsider in the Forrester household, the woman who had forced her way into their lives by sheer drive and love for Ridge. But now she was the villain, the one who had destroyed their fragile harmony. Hope stood abruptly, her chair tipping over, and fled the room, tears spilling down her cheeks. Brooke called after her, but the sound was drowned out by the noise of the slamming door. Thorne, ever the dutiful brother, walked to Ridge's side and rested his hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this," he murmured gently but without confidence. Ridge shook his head, but his gaze never left Brooke. "I don't know if we will," he answered, barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again," Brooke exclaimed, her palm leaping to her chest. She had always understood that her relationship with Ridge was precarious, built on a foundation of passion and promises that had been broken and repaired numerous times. But this, it felt definitive. The look in his eyes was not one of rage, but of defeat, of a man who had given his all and had nothing more to give. Nick took a step toward Brooke, as if to console her, but she stopped him. "Don't," she urged in a harsh voice. "You've done enough." The room fell silent again, with the only sound being the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Eric cleared his throat, his words soft yet forceful. "I think it's best if we all take some time," he told me. "This isn't something we can resolve tonight." The family members began to leave one by one, their footsteps heavy on the glossy floor. Stephanie took one last disapproving look at Brooke before following Eric out. Thorne paused for a moment, his eyes filled with sympathy, before exiting the room. Soon it was just Brooke, Nick, and Ridge, the 3 points of a triangle that had split the family. Ridge turned to leave but stopped at the door, placing his hand on the frame. "I loved you," he continued, his voice barely audible. "I gave you all I had. And this is how you repay me," he said without waiting for an answer. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed around the empty room. Brooke slumped to the floor, sobbing. Nick knelt alongside her, his hand hanging over her shoulder but without touching her. He knew better than to attempt. "I'm sorry," he murmured again, but the words were hollow and inadequate in light of what they had done. Brooke gazed up at him, her cheeks smeared with tears. "Why did we do this?" she asked, her voice scarcely audible. "Why did we let it get this far?" Nick had no response. He'd persuaded himself it was love, that his feelings for Brooke were worth the risk and the anguish. But now, looking at the devastation they'd wreaked, he wasn't so sure. Love was not supposed to feel like this, like an unhealable wound. The days that followed were a haze of pain and sorrow. Brooke moved out of the Forrester home, and into a modest apartment on the outskirts of LA. She avoided Forrester Creations, unable to bear the murmurs and scornful looks. Hope refused to talk to her, and her silence stung worse than any words could have. Nick attempted to reach out, but Brooke pushed him away. She couldn't bear to look at him, to be reminded of her frailty and failure. She spent her nights alone, staring at the ceiling, repeating the events that had led up to this point. She thought about Ridge, the life they'd built together, and the promises they'd made. She thought about Hope, her bright, beautiful daughter, who was suddenly lost to her in ways she had never imagined. Ridge, for his part, immersed himself in his craft, hiding his pain in ideas and patterns. But the spark that had always distinguished his inventions was vanished, replaced by a cold, mechanical perfection. He didn't talk about Brooke or mention her name, but her absence was a shadow that followed him everywhere. The Forrester family attempted to go on and reconstruct what had been damaged, but the cracks were too deep. When trust was broken, it was difficult to rebuild. Even though they put on a brave face for the outer world, the scandal of Brooke and Nick's betrayal persisted, like a festering sore that refused to heal. Brooke would sit by her window in the stillness of the night, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She'd think about Ridge's angry words, the love she'd lost, and wonder if there was any way to make things right. But deep inside she understood the truth. Some betrayals were too severe, some wounds too deep. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, she felt the weight of her decisions, a burden she would endure for the rest of her life. Brooke sat at the enormous bay window in the Forrester estate, gazing out at the gloomy California sky, which seemed heavy with an odd weight of silence. Her hands trembled, but she pushed them tightly together in her lap, as if force could keep her steady. Every second felt like an hour, and in those peaceful moments, memories she wanted to forget came flooding back. Nick's words, Nick's touch, Nick's promises, all came flooding back to her, leaving her breathless with remorse. She had crossed a line that she had promised herself she would never cross, and there was no way to go back. Ridge's voice rang in her mind, words from their past when he vowed that trust was everything between them. "We've been through storms, Logan," he had murmured once, stroking her hair away with tenderness that only he could display. "But as long as we tell each other the truth, nothing can break us." Those words were once a shield, but now they cut her like daggers since she had compromised the very thing she stood for. Nick had not intended for things to go so far either. That was what Brooke kept telling herself to soothe the pain of remorse. He was Ridge's half-brother, a guy with his own scars who had always felt like an outcast in the opulent Forrester family. Brooke was more than simply a friend to him. She listened when the weight of loneliness became too much. That night, when the wine poured and confessions became subtle touches, the border faded until there was none left. What was supposed to be comfort turned into treachery, and the instant it stopped, Brooke realized they had broken more than just loyalty. They had wrecked the frail basis of love. Ridge initially discovered the facts without shouting. It happened in silence. He had come into a conversation that was not intended for him. Pieces of words spoken in guilt, the kind of fragmented phrases that confirmed his worst fears. His eyes burned with amazement as he saw the two people he trusted the most standing in front of him like strangers. "Tell me this isn't true," he said quietly, his voice cracking with desperation rather than wrath. But the stillness that followed was the answer, and it ripped his heart in two. The rage arrived later, shaking the walls and leaving everyone stunned. Ridge's words were more than just cutting. They held years of commitment that suddenly seemed mocking. He told Brooke that she had not only betrayed his love, but also humiliated it, turning it into something frail and ludicrous. He told Nick that fraternity was important, that blood represented loyalty even when nothing else did, and that he had trampled on it without hesitation. The room was filled with the sound of Ridge's voice breaking, the sound of a man whose entire life had vanished in an instant. Brooke wanted to reach out to him, ask him to see that it had been a mistake, a moment of weakness rather than a betrayal of her heart. Ridge's ordinarily friendly eyes, however, were cold, distant and unidentifiable. "Don't," he whispered, backing away as if her touch would burn him. "Don't try to make this less than it is. You picked this. Both of you chose this." His words caused a mark that no apology could repair. In the days that followed, the Forrester mansion transformed from a home to a jail. Brooke walked the halls like a ghost, hearing murmurs and feeling the weight of each eye. Stephanie's look was the hardest of all, packed with the vindication she had hoped for. Brooke had always represented disaster in high heels, a hurricane that would one day crush Ridge. Stephanie didn't even need to say, "I told you so." Her silence spoke louder than words could. Nick tried to stand up and accept his role in the calamity, but the shame was written on his face. Not only had he betrayed his brother, but also himself. He'd wake up at night to the sound of his own shame, Ridge's voice informing him he was no longer his brother. The sea had always been Nick's shelter, the only place he could breathe, but now it teased him with its constant reminder of isolation. Brooke's heart ached in ways she had never felt before, not just for Ridge's loss, but also for the family that had been torn apart. She imagined the children's expressions when they realized the truth. She reflected on the holidays that would now be tarnished by the remembrance of this betrayal. Love was meant to be her guiding light, but somewhere along the way, she mistook love for loneliness, passion for desperation, and comfort for connection. And in her confusion she wrecked everything. The sad truth was that, even if Ridge's fury subsided over time, things would never return to normal. Trust, once broken, does not heal with simple forgiveness. It persists like a wound, constantly threatening to reopen. Brooke knew Ridge would never look at her again without seeing Nick's shadow between them, and Nick couldn't look at Ridge without feeling ashamed. Late at night, Brooke would sit alone and whisper Ridge's name, as if doing so would bring him back. She remembered their laughing, their hopes, and the promises they made under the stars. She recalled how he had told her she was his destiny. And now destiny felt like a cruel joke, because she had changed the story in a single act of vulnerability. Everywhere she looked in Los Angeles she saw images of him. The fashion house they developed together became unpleasant, with each sketch on the table representing a portion of their shared lives. Family dinners, which once provided comfort, have become battlegrounds of silence. Brooke recognized that treachery was a chain reaction that caused pain in every direction, leaving no heart unscathed. Ridge, despite his fury, bore the deepest sadness of all. He adored Brooke with a devotion that had endured decades of storms, rivalries, and heartbreaks. He had protected her when the world doubted her and supported her when she had fallen. To lose her not to a stranger, but to his own brother, was a wound too profound to describe. Even as his rage flared, there were times late at night when he sat alone, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he might have done something differently, whether he had failed her in some way that drove her into Nick's arms. But the truth is that love does not erase treachery. Love does not rewind time. Love cannot unhear the murmurs or see the expressions of guilt. Ridge's comments from the night he walked out lingered in the air. "You've taken everything that was good in us and burned it to ash." The finality of those remarks was evident. Brooke cried every day, but they did not bring healing. Nick's apologies were heavy, yet they yielded no forgiveness. Ridge's absence was more powerful than any argument. What remained was not only the loss of a romance, but also the demise of a belief that certain loves are unbreakable. Because even the strongest ties can fracture under the weight of betrayal, and when they do, the pieces cut deeply, leaving permanent scars. Brooke eventually discovered the saddest reality of all. Sometimes the greatest love tales finish in silence rather than with fire or anger. The hallways that once echoed with laughter are now silent. Silence in the bed that previously held warmth. Silence between two people who previously vowed they would be together forever. And in that silence she sat alone. The only sound she could hear was her own regret.